The moment they told him he was not allowed to board, no one realized they had just stopped the man who owned the very system they were standing in. The airport terminal in Chicago O'Hare was alive with its usual morning rhythm, rolling suitcases echoing across polished floors, overhead announcements blending into a constant hum of movement and urgency. Ethan Caldwell stood quietly near Gate B14, dressed in a simple navy jacket, a white shirt without a tie, and dark jeans that made him look like any other traveler heading home after a long trip. Nothing about him drew attention, and that was exactly how he preferred it. In his hand was a standard economy boarding pass for Flight 248 to San Francisco, folded neatly between his fingers. As passengers lined up in orderly rows, Ethan moved forward with them, his expression calm, unreadable, almost detached from the noise around him. When he reached the front of the line, he gently placed his phone in his pocket and looked up at the gate counter where Laura Bennett, the gate agent, was scanning documents with practiced efficiency. She was sharp-eyed, precise, and clearly accustomed to making quick decisions under pressure. She took his boarding pass, scanned it once, then again, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly. After a brief pause, she looked up at him with a professional but firm tone. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside for a moment." Ethan didn't react immediately. He simply nodded once, as if he had expected the statement. Behind him, passengers continued moving forward, unaware that something unusual was unfolding. Laura tapped her keyboard again, her eyes fixed on the screen, then leaned slightly closer to the microphone connected to the boarding system. "I'm sorry, but your boarding status has been flagged. You are not cleared to board at this time." Her voice was calm, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone following protocol. Ethan glanced briefly at the screen, then back at her. "May I ask why?" he asked evenly. Laura hesitated, her fingers still hovering over the keyboard. "It's a system notification. It doesn't provide detailed reasoning. I can only follow procedure." Behind her, Mark Simmons, a security guard stationed near the gate, shifted his stance and stepped slightly closer, observing the interaction with growing attention. Kevin Doyle, the supervising officer on duty, approached from the side corridor, his presence signaling that the situation was no longer routine. "Is there an issue here?" Kevin asked, his eyes moving between Ethan and Laura. Laura shook her head slightly. "Just a flag boarding pass. I'm handling it." Ethan remained still, his posture relaxed, almost unusually so for someone just denied boarding. Around them, the flow of passengers began to slow as subtle curiosity spread. A few travelers glanced over, sensing the shift in atmosphere without fully understanding it. Laura spoke again, this time more firmly. "Sir, you'll need to step away from the boarding line while we resolve this. It may take a few minutes." Ethan nodded again, this time slower, as if processing something far beyond the immediate situation. "Understood," he said quietly. He stepped back from the counter without protest, moving to the side near a row of empty seats overlooking the tarmac. Outside the large glass windows, aircraft taxied under a pale morning sky, completely indifferent to the small tension building inside the terminal. Kevin exchanged a brief look with Laura, then leaned slightly toward her. "Have you seen this flag before?" he asked. Laura shook her head. "Never. It's a priority restriction, but no explanation is attached." Mark crossed his arms, scanning Ethan from a distance, noting the calmness in his demeanor, something that didn't quite match the situation. Ethan sat down slowly, placing his boarding pass on his lap, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the runway. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't attempt to force his way forward. Instead, he simply observed, as if waiting for something only he could see coming. And in that quiet moment, while the world around him continued moving without pause, a decision made somewhere deep within a connected system had already begun to ripple outward in ways none of them could yet understand. The terminal lights above Gate B14 continued to glow with a steady, indifferent brightness as Ethan Caldwell remained seated near the large glass windows, his gaze fixed on the slow movement of aircraft outside. Inside the boarding area, the flow of passengers had resumed, but the atmosphere around the gate felt subtly altered, as if a quiet disturbance had settled beneath the surface of routine travel. Laura Bennett stood behind the counter, her attention repeatedly returning to the screen in front of her, where the same restriction message remained unchanged. She refreshed the system again, Then once more, each attempt returning the same result without explanation. Kevin Doyle stood slightly behind her, arms folded, watching the situation with growing uncertainty. "Still no update from the system?" he asked. Laura shook her head. "Nothing. It is still flagged as a priority restriction with no supporting notes." Mark Simmons shifted his weight near the boarding lane, glancing occasionally toward Ethan, who had not moved from his seat. There was no frustration in Ethan's posture, no visible irritation, only a stillness that felt unusual in a place defined by urgency. Kevin stepped closer to the terminal screen, lowering his voice. "Priority restrictions do not usually appear without authorization from higher administrative levels. Did dispatch send anything?" Laura checked her messages quickly. No direct communication, only the automated flag. A brief silence followed. The boarding line behind them had thinned, but a few passengers remained nearby, observing with subtle curiosity. One traveler checked his watch repeatedly, while another leaned slightly to see past the counter, sensing that something outside the normal flow of operations was unfolding. Ethan remained seated, his hands resting loosely in his lap, his attention shifting occasionally between the boarding gate and the distant runway. He did not check his phone again. Instead, he waited with an almost deliberate patience, as if the situation unfolding was not unexpected, merely delayed. Laura finally exhaled softly, leaning closer to Kevin. "I'm going to escalate this to airline operations. We cannot proceed without clarification." Kevin nodded once. "Do it. Something about this does not feel standard." She picked up the phone mounted behind the counter and dialed a short internal extension. After a brief exchange, she lowered her voice, speaking more carefully as she described the flagged passenger and the lack of system explanation. As she waited for a response, Ethan's name was spoken quietly over the phone line. Laura straightened slightly. "Yes, that is correct. Ethan Caldwell." A pause followed on the other end. Laura's expression shifted subtly, her brows drawing together as she listened. Kevin noticed the change immediately. "What did they say?" he asked once she lowered the receiver slightly. Laura hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. "They said to hold the boarding process and await direct clearance from executive operations." The words created a noticeable shift in the air around the gate. Kevin frowned. "Executive operations?" Laura nodded slowly, her attention now fully focused on the screen again. "Yes, they said it is not a standard passenger review. It is being handled at a higher level." Mark, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "Higher level than airport control?" Laura did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked once more toward Ethan, who was still seated near the window. Something in her expression changed, a subtle uncertainty replacing her earlier confidence. She stepped slightly away from the counter, lowering her voice further. "They also asked for confirmation of his exact identity, spelling, and booking reference." Kevin exhaled quietly, his earlier certainty beginning to fade. "That is not typical procedure." Laura nodded in agreement. "No, it is not." At that moment, Ethan slowly stood from his seat. The movement was unhurried, deliberate. He adjusted his jacket lightly, then picked up his boarding pass again. He did not approach the counter. Instead, he remained where he was, watching the gate from a distance that now felt intentional rather than passive. Laura noticed his movement and instinctively straightened. Kevin followed her gaze. For a brief moment, none of them spoke. The boarding area, once filled with routine announcements and steady motion, felt suspended in a quiet uncertainty, as if the normal rules governing the space had temporarily shifted without warning. The silence at the gate had grown heavier, not from noise or action, but from the absence of certainty, as if the normal rhythm of airport operations had been quietly interrupted by something no one could fully see. Ethan Caldwell still stood near the glass wall, his reflection faint against the moving aircraft outside, while behind the counter Laura Bennett continued monitoring the system screen with increasing focus. The same restriction message remained unchanged, but now her expression carried a subtle tension that had not been there before. Kevin Doyle stood beside her, his posture more alert than earlier, his attention divided between the system terminal and Ethan, who had not attempted to approach the counter again. Mark Simmons remained slightly back from the boarding lane, scanning the area with a measured calm, though even he seemed to sense that the situation was no longer routine. Laura finally spoke into her headset again, this time more slowly. carefully repeating the passenger details. A few seconds passed before she received a response, and the change in her expression was immediate but restrained. She lowered the headset slightly. They confirmed the restriction is not local, she said quietly. Kevin frowned. Not local means what exactly? Laura hesitated before answering. It means it was applied at a corporate system level, not at airport control or gate operations. The words seemed to shift the atmosphere again. Kevin looked at the screen more closely, as if expecting additional information to appear. So we are dealing with airline headquarters authorization? He asked. Laura nodded slightly. Yes, but even they are requesting verification before removing it. Mark stepped closer now, his voice lower. That means the passenger is not simply flagged. He is known at a level above standard clearance. The phrase lingered in the air for a moment before fading into the background hum of the terminal. Ethan, still standing near the window, slowly turned his head toward the gate. He did not look frustrated or surprised. Instead, there was a quiet recognition in his expression, as if the delay had now reached the point he had anticipated. Laura noticed his movement and briefly glanced away from the screen, uncertainty growing in her posture. She tapped the keyboard again, pulling up the limited passenger profile visible through the system. The information displayed was minimal, almost incomplete, as if intentionally restricted. Kevin leaned in slightly. Does it show anything else? He asked. Laura shook her head. Only name, booking reference, and a note stating executive verification required. Mark exhaled slowly. That is not something we see for a standard economy passenger. A short silence followed as all three employees processed the implications without stating them directly. Behind them, a passenger waiting for boarding shifted uncomfortably, checking the time on a wristwatch before looking toward the gate with growing impatience. Ethan remained still, his posture unchanged, his attention now directed fully toward the counter. After a moment, Laura picked up the internal phone again, her tone more formal as she requested escalation once more. This time the response took longer. When it finally came, she listened without interruption, her expression gradually tightening as the message continued. Kevin noticed her silence and stepped closer. What is it? He asked. Laura lowered the receiver slowly. They are sending an executive liaison to the gate, she said. Kevin blinked once. From airline headquarters? Laura nodded. Yes. They want direct confirmation in person before any decision is made. Mark shifted slightly, his gaze now moving between the boarding lane and Ethan, as if reassessing the entire situation from a different perspective. The boarding process had not officially resumed, yet the energy at the gate had completely changed. Ethan took a slow step forward for the first time since sitting down, stopping just short of the counter boundary. He placed his boarding pass on the edge of the counter without speaking. Laura looked at it, then at him, then back toward the terminal corridor where executive personnel would soon arrive. The usual clarity of airport procedure had been replaced by something less defined, a space where every action now carried weight beyond its surface meaning. And as the minutes continued to pass without resolution, the entire gate seemed to wait for something none of them could yet name, but all of them now understood was unavoidable. The corridor leading to Gate B14 had begun to feel narrower, not in physical space, but in the way attention and anticipation compressed everything into a single unfolding moment. Ethan Caldwell remained standing near the counter, his boarding pass still resting on the edge where he had placed it earlier, untouched by anyone. Laura Bennett kept her eyes fixed on the system screen, but her focus was no longer steady. It shifted between the glowing restriction notice and the quiet man in front of her who showed no sign of agitation. Kevin Doyle had stopped asking questions for the moment, his attention now divided between the terminal entrance and the subtle changes in tone spreading through the staff area. Mark Simmons had straightened slightly, his posture more formal than before, as if instinctively adjusting to an unseen level of importance approaching the gate. The announcement of an executive liaison had changed the atmosphere completely, and even though no one had yet arrived, the expectation of their presence was already influencing every movement and every pause. Laura adjusted her headset again, this time receiving confirmation that the liaison was now inside the secure corridor and would arrive within minutes. She lowered her hand slowly and spoke without looking away from the screen. They are here, she said quietly. Kevin turned his head toward the corridor entrance. How many? He asked. Laura responded after a brief pause. 1. Direct Executive Operations Representative. The words seemed to settle over the group like a heavier silence. Ethan finally shifted his stance slightly, not in response to urgency, but as if acknowledging that the situation had now reached its intended point of resolution. He did not retrieve his boarding pass, nor did he attempt to clarify anything further. Instead, he simply observed the gate with a calm focus that felt increasingly out of place in the growing tension around him. The corridor door opened, and a man in a dark professional suit stepped through with measured pace. His presence was immediately different from the surrounding airport staff. There was no hesitation in his movement, no uncertainty in his gaze. He carried a tablet in one hand and an identification badge clipped neatly to his jacket. As he approached the counter, Laura straightened instinctively, and Kevin stepped slightly to the side. Mark Simmons moved half a step back without realizing it. The executive liaison stopped at the counter and scanned the situation in a single, efficient glance. His eyes briefly landed on Ethan, then on the system screen, and finally on Laura. "Report," he said simply. Laura responded immediately, summarizing the restriction, the lack of system explanation, and the escalation request. The man listened without interruption, his expression unchanged. When she finished, he tapped once on his tablet, pulling up internal records. The silence during those few seconds felt heavier than before, as if the entire gate had been placed on pause. Ethan remained still, his gaze now directed toward the liaison rather than the screen or the staff. After reviewing the data, the liaison raised his eyes slightly. "This is not a standard boarding restriction," he said calmly. Kevin exhaled quietly. "We already understood that." The liaison continued, ignoring the comment. "This is a system-wide executive designation linked to verified identity protocols beyond airport authority." Laura's expression tightened slightly. "So what does that mean for boarding clearance?" she asked. The liaison paused for a moment, then turned slightly toward Ethan again, studying him more carefully than anyone else had so far. "It means the passenger is not being evaluated at the airport level," he said. "The verification is external and still in progress." A faint shift moved through the group, not confusion, but realization that they were no longer part of the decision-making chain. Ethan finally spoke for the first time since the liaison arrived, his voice calm and steady. "And how long will that process take?" The liaison looked at him directly now, holding the gaze for a moment longer than professional courtesy required. "That depends on confirmation from corporate executive authorization," he replied. The statement hung in the air without further explanation. Around them, the boarding area remained active in appearance but frozen in function, as if the normal rules of departure had been quietly suspended. No one spoke after that, and the only movement came from distant passengers continuing their routines without understanding that at Gate B14, the situation had already moved beyond anything standard procedure could resolve. The executive liaison remained standing at the counter, his presence anchoring the entire gate in a controlled stillness that felt almost unnatural compared to the usual rhythm of airport movement. Ethan Caldwell continued to observe him without interruption, his posture unchanged, his expression calm and steady, as if the unfolding process was something he had already anticipated long before anyone else became aware of it. Laura Bennett kept her attention on the terminal screen, though her confidence had visibly shifted. Each refresh of the system only confirmed the same unresolved restriction, now reinforced by the liaison's explanation that the decision existed beyond airport jurisdiction. Kevin Doyle stood slightly behind her, his earlier authority softened by the realization that the matter had escalated far beyond standard operational protocol. Mark Simmons had stopped scanning the surrounding area and was now focused entirely on the exchange at the counter, his stance quieter, more restrained, as if recalibrating his understanding of the situation in real time. The liaison reviewed something on his tablet once more, then spoke in a measured tone. "The verification process is not delayed by error," he said. "It is intentionally structured to prevent premature clearance until full identity confirmation is completed." Laura nodded slightly, absorbing the information. "Is there any estimated time of resolution?" she asked. The liaison did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced once again toward Ethan, who now stood closer to the counter but still made no attempt to assert himself. After a brief pause, the liaison responded. There is no fixed duration. Executive validation requires cross-confirmation from multiple corporate entities. Kevin frowned. Multiple entities within the airline system? The liaison corrected him calmly. Not only the airline system. The clarification introduced a new layer of uncertainty, one that shifted the understanding of everyone present. Laura lowered her gaze slightly, then spoke more carefully. So the passenger cannot be cleared even if all airport systems are functional. The liaison nodded once. Correct. The decision does not originate here. A quiet tension spread through the group as the meaning settled in. Ethan finally placed both hands lightly on the counter, not in frustration, but in a steady, deliberate posture that suggested patience rather than urgency. And during this process, he said calmly, "Am I expected to remain outside the boarding area indefinitely?" The liaison met his gaze directly. "You are not under restriction in the traditional sense of denial," he replied. "You are in a temporary holding status pending identity synchronization." The phrasing drew a subtle silence from Laura and Kevin, both of whom exchanged a brief glance. Mark shifted his weight slightly, but said nothing. Ethan considered the response for a moment, then nodded once, as if accepting the explanation without resistance. Around them, boarding activity for other passengers continued in parallel, but the energy at Gate B14 remained isolated, separated from the normal flow of departures. A few passengers nearby had begun observing more openly, sensing that the delay was not routine. One traveler checked the time repeatedly, while another leaned toward the counter area, trying to understand the reason for the extended pause. The liaison stepped slightly aside, tapping a final command into his tablet. "Corporate Executive Operations has acknowledged the escalation," he stated. "They will initiate direct confirmation shortly." Laura exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing slightly, but not fully relaxing. Kevin looked toward Ethan again, his expression now less skeptical and more uncertain. Mark lowered his gaze briefly, then returned his attention to the corridor entrance, as if expecting another arrival. Ethan, however, remained unchanged. He did not react to the mention of corporate acknowledgement. He did not move closer or farther away. Instead, he maintained his position with a quiet composure that contrasted sharply with the escalating administrative complexity surrounding him. The liaison stepped back slightly from the counter, signaling that his role in the immediate interaction had concluded. "At this point," he said, "further action will depend entirely on executive confirmation." The words settled over the group, marking a transition from procedural uncertainty to something more final in tone, though still unresolved in outcome. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The gate remained suspended in a state of waiting, where every system had spoken but none had yet delivered closure, and where the only certainty left was that the next response would come from a level no one at the gate could directly see. The atmosphere at Gate B14 had shifted into a controlled stillness, the kind that exists when every participant in a situation is waiting for authority that has not yet arrived but already defines the outcome. Ethan Caldwell remained near the counter, his posture unchanged, his presence steady and unforced, as if time itself had slowed around him rather than the other way around. Laura Bennett stood behind the gate terminal, her hands resting lightly near the keyboard, no longer actively attempting new inputs into the system. The restriction message had not changed, but its meaning had evolved through repetition and escalation, now tied to executive verification beyond her operational control. Kevin Doyle remained beside her, his earlier confidence replaced with a measured silence, his attention divided between Ethan and the corridor that led to executive access points. Mark Simmons stood a few feet back, no longer acting as an active observer of passengers, but instead as someone waiting for instruction that had not yet arrived. The executive liaison who had delivered the previous confirmation had stepped aside, now speaking quietly into a secure communication device near the edge of the gate area. His tone was precise and controlled, indicating direct contact with higher administrative channels. Laura glanced at him briefly, then returned her attention forward as her headset received a new incoming transmission. She listened carefully, her expression tightening slightly as the message progressed. When she finally responded, her voice carried a more formal tone. "They are initiating live verification from Corporate Executive Operations Headquarters," she said. Kevin exhaled slowly. "Live verification?" Laura nodded. Direct confirmation protocol. They are connecting to the gate in real time. A subtle shift moved through the area as the meaning of that statement settled. This was no longer a delayed clearance or a system correction. It was a direct evaluation occurring in real time between corporate authority and the current gate situation. Ethan remained still, his gaze steady, his attention fixed not on the staff, but on the space beyond them, as if anticipating the exact moment this process would resolve. The liaison stepped forward again, lowering his device. The executive operations line is now active, he said calmly. They are requesting visual confirmation of the passenger at the gate. Laura immediately adjusted the camera feed from the gate terminal, aligning it toward Ethan. Kevin subtly stepped aside to ensure a clear line of sight. Ethan did not move. He did not adjust his posture or attempt to present himself differently. Instead, he stood exactly as he had since the beginning, composed and silent. The video feed transmitted for several seconds without interruption. During that time, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint background noise of the terminal and the occasional distant announcement of other flights unrelated to Gate B14. Then, Laura's headset received a direct response. Her expression changed instantly, not into surprise or confusion, but into something closer to recognition. She looked up from the screen slowly. "Corporate Executive Operations has confirmed identity match," she said. Kevin blinked once. "So he is cleared?" Laura hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "They have confirmed identity, but clearance status requires final authorization acknowledgement from System Override Authority." The liaison nodded once, as if expecting that outcome. "That authorization is being completed now," he said. Ethan finally shifted his gaze toward Laura, then toward the liaison, acknowledging the progression without reaction. The gate remained silent, but the sense of anticipation had intensified, not through sound, but through the awareness that a final resolution was approaching. A few seconds passed without movement. Then Laura's system screen changed. The restriction notice disappeared entirely, replaced by a simple, cleared status indicator. At the same moment, her headset confirmed final authorization receipt. She looked up slowly, her expression neutral but fully attentive. Kevin leaned slightly forward. "Is it complete?" he asked. Laura nodded. "Boarding clearance has been fully authorized at executive level." The liaison confirmed with a short glance at his device, then stepped back slightly, signaling that his role had concluded. Ethan remained in place for a brief moment longer, as if verifying that the process had truly reached completion. Then he reached forward calmly and retrieved his boarding pass from the counter. The surrounding staff did not speak. The gate, once filled with procedural tension and layered uncertainty, had returned to functional clarity, though the silence that followed carried a different weight than before, one shaped by the understanding that what had just occurred had operated entirely outside the normal boundaries of routine airport decision-making. The confirmation of clearance had settled over Gate B14 like a quiet aftershock, leaving behind a kind of silence that was no longer uncertainty, but reflection. Ethan Caldwell stood for a moment near the counter, holding his boarding pass in his hand, not moving immediately toward the boarding line. The system screen behind Laura Bennett now displayed a standard cleared status, as if nothing unusual had ever occurred. Yet everyone present understood that what had just unfolded was far from ordinary. Laura remained behind the counter, her posture composed again, though her eyes still carried the trace of what she had just witnessed. Kevin Doyle had stepped slightly back, no longer intervening, no longer analyzing aloud, simply observing Ethan with a more measured perspective. Mark Simmons had also relaxed his stance, though his attention remained fixed on Ethan as he prepared to proceed. The executive liaison had already shifted to the side, his role complete, speaking quietly into his device before stepping away from the immediate gate area. Ethan finally moved forward, not hurried, not hesitant, simply steady in his pace as he approached the boarding lane. Laura lifted her gaze briefly as he passed the counter. There was no longer any restriction in her tone when she spoke, only professionalism. "You are cleared for boarding," she said. Ethan gave a small nod in acknowledgement. Kevin stepped slightly aside to allow passage, his expression neutral but attentive. Mark Simmons opened the gate path without speaking, guiding the flow forward as normal procedure resumed. Yet behind the restored order, the earlier sequence of events still lingered in the awareness of the staff. As Ethan reached the boarding threshold, he paused briefly, not because he was stopped, but because the moment itself seemed to invite reflection. He turned slightly, glancing once more toward the gate counter where the process had begun. Laura met his gaze for a brief instant, then lowered her eyes back to the terminal screen. There was no additional comment, no attempt to revisit what had occurred. The system now functioned as it always had, but the memory of its temporary override remained unspoken. Ethan then stepped forward into the boarding tunnel. The movement was smooth and uninterrupted, blending back into the normal rhythm of passenger flow. Behind him, Laura exhaled quietly, her hands resting still on the counter. Kevin looked toward her. "That was not standard procedure," he said calmly. Laura nodded once. "No," she replied. "It was not." Mark, who had remained silent through most of the exchange, finally spoke in a low tone. "I have not seen an executive verification process escalate like that in a long time." Kevin glanced toward the boarding tunnel where Ethan had disappeared. "Neither have I," he said. The three of them stood for a moment without further discussion, each processing the same realization in different ways. The liaison had already left the immediate area, leaving behind only the aftermath of the confirmation process and the restored system state. At the gate, boarding continued as scheduled, passengers moving forward in orderly succession, unaware of the precise nature of what had just taken place. Yet among the staff at Gate B14, there was a shared understanding that this particular departure had involved layers of authorization far beyond the visible structure of airport operations. Laura eventually returned to her terminal screen, resuming standard procedures. Kevin stepped back into his supervisory position. Mark returned to monitoring the flow of passengers. And as the final travelers passed through the gate, the moment of disruption faded into operational normalcy, leaving behind only the quiet recognition that some identities within the system operated on levels not immediately visible, but undeniably decisive when activated. The aircraft taxied steadily across the runway under a pale morning sky as Ethan Caldwell settled into his seat near the window, finally removed from the environment of Gate B14. The cabin was quiet in the way most early flights are, filled with the soft rustling of seatbelts being adjusted and the low hum of passengers preparing for departure. Ethan placed his boarding pass into the seat pocket in front of him and leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged from earlier, calm and composed as if the events at the gate were only a brief interruption rather than something unusual. Flight attendants moved through the aisle performing standard checks, their voices soft and professional, ensuring all passengers were properly seated. Around him, other travelers remained unaware of anything that had occurred before boarding, their attention focused on luggage storage and flight duration announcements. Ethan turned his gaze toward the window, watching the ground slowly shift as the plane aligned for takeoff. There was no urgency in his demeanor, no visible trace of frustration or satisfaction, only a steady awareness that the situation had resolved as expected. Meanwhile, back at Gate B14, the atmosphere had returned to its standard operational rhythm. Laura Bennett was once again focused on routine boarding procedures, her hands moving efficiently between the scanner and terminal screen. Kevin Doyle had resumed his supervisory position near the boarding lane, directing passenger flow without interruption. Mark Simmons stood at a relaxed but attentive posture, ensuring compliance with standard security flow, though his earlier alertness had softened. The executive liaison had already left the area, his presence no longer required after confirmation had been completed. The system no longer displayed any restriction, and the boarding records reflected full clearance without additional flags or notes. However, within the minds of the staff, the sequence of events had not fully faded. Laura occasionally paused between scans, her expression briefly reflective before returning to procedure. Kevin maintained operational focus, but his earlier comments were not repeated, as if the situation had already been mentally filed away under uncommon executive intervention. Mark continued monitoring passengers, yet his attention occasionally drifted toward the now-quiet boarding counter where everything had begun. As the final passengers for the flight passed through the gate, Laura completed the last verification scan and confirmed the closure of boarding procedures. Kevin gave a subtle nod, signaling completion of the process. Mark confirmed the final passenger count and secured the gate area. The terminal screen displayed a standard status update indicating departure readiness. There was no remaining sign of restriction, no system alerts, no anomalies visible in the interface. Yet despite the return to normal function, the memory of the earlier escalation remained present in a quiet, unspoken way among the staff. It was not discussed openly, nor recorded beyond formal system logs, but it lingered as an internal reference point for each of them. Laura eventually stepped away from the counter, adjusting her headset and preparing for the next assigned gate rotation. Kevin reviewed his schedule on a handheld device before moving toward the supervisory office corridor. Mark repositioned himself for the next boarding cycle, returning fully to standard duty expectations. Outside the gate windows, the airport continued its constant flow of arrivals and departures, indifferent to individual moments of disruption or resolution. Inside Gate B14, everything appeared unchanged once more, yet beneath the surface of routine operations, the awareness remained that certain passengers moved through systems governed not only by procedure, but by layers of authority rarely visible at the operational level. The aircraft had already climbed above the city, leaving the ground below reduced to a quiet pattern of roads, buildings, and distant movement that looked almost abstract from 30,000 feet in the air. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere remained calm and routine, with passengers settling into their seats, adjusting tray tables, or simply staring out at the sky as the flight continued on its scheduled path toward San Francisco. Ethan Caldwell sat by the window in the same composed manner he had maintained throughout the entire sequence of events at the airport. There was no sign of tension in his posture, no lingering frustration, only a steady stillness as if the entire situation had already been fully processed and left behind. A flight attendant passed through the aisle offering standard refreshments, her voice polite and neutral, moving with the practiced rhythm of long-distance flight service. Ethan declined with a simple nod and returned his attention to the horizon outside the window, where clouds stretched endlessly in layered formations. Somewhere far below, the airport he had departed from continued operating without interruption, unaware of how briefly its internal systems had been redirected through multiple layers of executive confirmation. At Gate B14, operations had fully transitioned into routine completion mode. The boarding logs had been finalized, passenger lists confirmed, and system reports automatically closed without any outstanding alerts. Laura Bennett had already moved on to processing documentation for the next assigned gate, her focus back on standard procedure and time-sensitive coordination tasks. Kevin Doyle was reviewing operational summaries in the supervisory office, ensuring that all procedures related to the earlier delay had been properly recorded according to protocol. Mark Simmons had resumed his normal security rotation duties, scanning passenger flow in other sections of the terminal with no further involvement in the previous incident. The executive liaison had submitted his final report through internal channels and was no longer physically present within the terminal structure. In official records, the event at Gate B14 now appeared as a resolved executive-level verification process, marked complete without further action required. Yet despite the clean procedural closure, the experience remained present in subtle ways among those who had directly witnessed it. Laura occasionally paused while reviewing unrelated passenger data, her thoughts briefly returning to the moment when the system restriction had escalated beyond local authority. Kevin, while maintaining professional composure, had developed a more cautious approach when reviewing unusual system flags, even those that appeared routine at first glance. Mark, though fully returned to standard security duty, remained more observant of interactions that involved administrative overrides or unexplained clearance delays. None of them spoke about it directly, as there was no procedural requirement to do so, but the memory existed as an internal reference point for each of them. Meanwhile, Ethan remained unaware of these reflections as he continued his flight, seated quietly as the aircraft maintained steady altitude. He opened a small folder containing standard travel documents, reviewed them briefly, then closed it again and placed it aside. His attention returned to the window, where the sky remained uninterrupted and vast. The flight continued smoothly without announcement or incident, maintaining its expected duration and route. As the aircraft crossed over the western states, cabin lighting shifted slightly to accommodate cruising conditions, and passengers settled further into quiet comfort. Ethan adjusted his seat minimally, maintaining the same composed demeanor he had displayed from the beginning of the journey. There was no indication in his behavior of urgency or concern, only a steady acceptance that the sequence of events that had unfolded earlier had reached its conclusion without further complication. On the ground, airport systems across multiple levels continued their synchronized operations, logging departures, arrivals, and system confirmations as part of the continuous flow of air traffic management. The earlier executive verification event remained stored in digital records, accessible only through authorized channels, without public visibility or operational impact on ongoing flights. At Gate B14, the shift change had already occurred, and new staff were unaware of the earlier situation unless they reviewed archived logs. Life within the terminal had moved forward seamlessly, as it always did, carrying thousands of passengers through countless gates, each with their own unnoticed complexities and quiet resolutions. And as Ethan's flight continued steadily toward its destination, the moment that had briefly interrupted an entire operational system now existed only as a closed entry in a secure record, leaving behind no disruption in schedule, but a lasting awareness among those few who had stood closest to its unfolding.